Just when you thought Briar would be the freakiest thing we'd see in a while, it appears Riot is nowhere near close to being done surprising us. Enter Hui, who many have already drew the obvious connection to Dota 2's Invoker thanks to the similarities in their playstyle. I can already picture the Brazilian Mordecai's jokes with this name. When Aphelios first came out, that was the same impression people had with him, as he could mix and match his different weapons for different combinations. But it was more just each weapon using the other as supplementary fire rather than actual permutations of attacks. When everyone saw Hui's gameplay trailer and ability showcase, they were quick to chalk him up as another inappropriately ambitious attempt by Riot's immaculate 200 years of game design. And while I'm all for having very overreactive, knee-jerk responses as much as the next guy, after I sat down and looked at Hui's moveset in its entirety, I found myself not as confounded as I half expected to be. In any case, for our next 200 years or well-designed first impressions episode, let's talk about Hui, the edgy goth teenager. The Visionary. Just like I underscored in my Briar first impressions video, the vibe I got from Hui leans more towards opting for straightforward concepts, but executing them more creatively, not so much open-ended ambiguous connotations. Technically, he does have the highest number of individually distinct abilities, but when you really break it down and think about it, it's not as convoluted as it would appear. In fact, I'd wager that Aphelios is still more nebulous to understand than Hui. Curiously, he will be the first dedicated artillery mage we've seen in a very long time, the latest one before him being Vel'Koz, who came out almost a full decade ago. Man, League is old. I can't believe we're closer to Season 20 than Season 4. Artillery mages are pretty cut and dry. They have almost no semblance of defense or mobility and spec fully into damage and range. This means the best game state for them to be in is neutral, repeatedly poking you down with long distance fire while keeping just out of range of the enemy team's ability to reach you. Unique to Hui is that he's designed to be an artillery mage and a controller, making him flex into mid and support. Not the most off-the-cuff pair in the game, Vel'Koz and Xerath frequently get played as supports much to every ADC main's dismay, but that's to say they are viable. He accomplishes this by formatting his basic abilities to be used in sequential order, effectively being the first true combo character. Signature of the Visionary causes damaging abilities to mark enemies dead for 4 seconds. Hui's next instance of damage against him with a different ability, keyword different, consumes a mark to create an explosion beneath them for a sizable chunk of magic damage after just under a second. This passive should tell you everything you need to know about his playstyle. You strike him with one ability, then strike him with another for quick 1-2 bursts of damage. Being a painter, Hui overlays his basic abilities with each other for different effects, not unlike how combining 2 colors can produce an altogether new one. It's a nice thematic touch that actually has an incentive to be transcribed into this style of gameplay. Subject Disaster has a mentor and aggressive stance, whereby the next use of his Q, W, or E will be offensive in nature. Subject Serenity has mentor a supportive stance, whereby the next use of his Q, W, or E will be augmentative in nature. Subject Torment has mentor a chaotic stance, whereby the next use of his Q, W, or E will be debilitative in nature. Additionally, upon entering any of these stances, Hui can get rid of the stance with Wash Brush if you ever change your mind. So in other words, the first cast of your Q, W, or E will dictate what stance you enter, and then the second cast of your Q, W, E will dictate the type of ability it has. In essence, Hui has 3 Qs, 3 Ws, and 3 Es, for a total of 9 basic abilities. Already this may come off as overwhelming, but to be honest, each individual ability is surprisingly rudimentary. So while Hui has a lot of different abilities, in totality he's a very simple champion. Disaster Q is Devastating Fire, a big fireball in a straight line that explodes on contact with the initial enemy and damages all nearby enemies for a % max health magic damage. All things considered, Devastating Fire is identical to Karma's Mantra Q but without the slow. Disaster W is Severing Bolt, calling a lightning bolt that strikes a target area for magic damage. If any target struck by this attack is under the effects of crowd control, they take increased damage based on their missing health for up to triple the base damage. In this instance, Severing Bolt is not that different from Xerath's W, only it's more conditional in damage. Disaster E is Molten Fissure, creating a big chunk of molten lava that damages and slows all enemies standing on it over time. There's the initial explosion that creates a fissure and the following damage over time. You can think of this ability almost like a fiery version of Braun's ultimate, but instead of a knockup, it's damage over time. So as you can tell from Hui's Q abilities, they're pretty chill. Q is a skill shot projectile, W is an area blast, and E is a straight line of damage. The overall goal of Hui's Q is to deal damage. In fact, his descriptions are so small you can fit all 3 of his Qs into one screenshot. Devastating Fire is used for poke damage, Severing Bolt is used to follow up on crowd control for big damage, and Molten Fissure is used for control and wave clear essentially. Serenity Q is Fleeting Current, projecting a stream of water that grants bonus movement speed to all allies for as long as they remain in the area. This reminds me of Galio's old W, not gonna lie, only it doesn't do any damage, kinda takes me back. Serenity W is Full of Reflection, creating a circular area on the ground that gives a stacking and regenerating shield to all friendlies that stand within. You can equate this to Milio's Cozy Campfire, except instead of incremental healing, it's incremental shielding. Serenity E is Stirring Lights, imbuing his next 3 basic attacks or damaging abilities to deal bonus magic damage and restore mana. so it's almost exactly the same as Nami's Tide Color Blessing, only it recovers mana instead of slowing enemies. Once again, very simple. Each of his abilities are structured to have one job and one job only, with no frills, spells, or whistles to speak of. I do like how they made it so he can use his utility abilities for both mid and support. Torment Q is Grim Visage, a straight line skill shot that damages and fears the first enemy hit. So it's a Morgana binding, only instead of a root, it's a fear. Torment W is Gaze of the Abyss, tossing an eyeball at a target location that, after a brief delay, chases after the nearest visible enemy champion within range, damaging and rooting them. Gaze of the Abyss might be the only truly innovative ability in Hui's kit, as I don't think there's anything else like this. An auto-homing CC that guarantees to get rooted if you're standing within the circle may be reminiscent of other area-type crowd controls like Vex's Looming Darkness or Swain's old Never Move, but the eyeball thingy is what makes it rather interesting. Finally, Torment E is Crushing Maw, marking a target location that pulls enemies from both sides to the center. This is basically a ranged remote control set face breaker, which is the best way I can describe it. Once more, very simple abilities with different functions. If you want something more guaranteed, go Grim Visage. If you want longer lasting crowd control, use Gaze of the Abyss. A 2.25 second root is pretty long. And I guess if you have Yasuo on your team, you should use Crushing Maw. To be honest, I'm not sure when you want to use Crushing Maw since it's the only non-immobilizing crowd control of the three. I guess the advantage is that it's the only one that can affect multiple targets. In a way, what Hui lacks in quality he makes up for in quantity. Rather than having one ability that does three things, he has three abilities that do one thing each. But if I may speak freely for a moment, despite it being narratively accurate to his motif of being a painter, I'm not a fan of designing a champion this way. Hui's abilities are too one-dimensional. Disaster is just 3 different iterations of damage with very little utility to speak of. Serenity is just 3 different forms of bust that do little more than what's written on the tooltip. Though this makes them refreshingly digestible, I feel like they give off the illusion of depth and not actual depth, which might backfire on him in the future. At the risk of sounding pessimistic, let me remind you this is merely my first impressions. From a pragmatic standpoint, with how overly simple each ability is, it's highly likely that players will default to just using only 1 or 2 out of each group of abilities, resulting in a high skill floor, low skill ceiling for the champion. Since you can only use 1 Disaster, 1 Serenity, and 1 Torment ability per rotation, each group of 3 abilities has to compete for that spot, which leads to gauging the opportunity cost of each ability. If you use Devastating Fire, you won't be able to use Severing Bolt or Molten Fissure. The idea is for each of these abilities to be unique in application so as to merit a more favorable opportunity cost in specific situations. Severing Bolt, for example, being the obvious choice against enemies with low health that are crowd controlled. Thing is, I can't help but feel like at any point throughout Hui's timeline when he's released to live servers, there will always be one that's just better than the other two. Hypothetically, I don't see why you would want to use Molten Fissure over Devastating Fire, even if you're trying to clear the wave. The coverage of Molten Fissure is nowhere near wide enough to hit the entire wave for its duration, plus, it takes too long to apply its damage in comparison to the other two, so even if you're fighting in a choke point, Devastating Fire seems like the more optimal choice, especially thanks to its max out damage. The 30% slow you get from Molten Fissure isn't consequential enough compared to just dealing more damage and immediately. The same holds true even for Serenity. While each ability has functionally different effects, I feel like most support players will just default to Pool of Reflection in combat as it's the most beneficial to their team than the other two. Meanwhile, if you're going Hui mid, you're obviously going to use Stirring Lights to sustain your exorbitant mana costs. There's a clear optimal choice to go for, which means you might just be spamming the same 3 out of 9 abilities every time. It's kind of the same thing as Twisted Fate's pick a card. In the past, 90% of the time you just wanted the gold one, because a point and click 2 second stun was just so valuable, so in order to add more incentive to his other 2 cards, more specifically the blue card, they jacked up their AP ratios to deal substantially higher damage than gold card. In fact, blue card deals more than double gold card's damage, leveling the opportunity cost of all 3 abilities. There isn't as big of a power discrepancy in Hui's moves due to them behaving differently from one another, not just being damage and effect modifiers on his next basic attack, but even then, one will always have more practical benefits than the others. The opportunity cost dilemma within Hui's abilities extends to his entire identity. Because he has 9 potential abilities, Riot made the right call in keeping each ability as one-dimensional as possible so as not to overload the champion. Even though in practice you'll only use one at a time, the potential to use other abilities means if you give each one too much, they'll collectively result in a champion who is too capable, by extension having no weaknesses. In layman's terms, Hui is the jack of all trades, master of none. When facing a dedicated artillery mage like Xerath or Ziggs, he's gonna get out DPS'd, and it's not even close. Against a dedicated enchanter like Nami or Soraka, Hui will be out-supported. Against a dedicated crowd control specialist like Leona, Nautilus, or Thresh, Hui won't be anywhere near as effective at lockdown or disruption. Hui has damage, utility, and control all in one package. Moreover, he covers multiple aspects of each field at the same time, spreading his power budget far too thin to where it actually hurts him more than it helps. Each of his disaster abilities are basically downgraded versions of other champions' skills. Zera's Eye of Destruction is an infinitely better Severing Bolt because it's not conditional. Karma's Inner Flame and by extension Soul Flare are infinitely better than Devastating Fire. Sona's Aria of Perseverance or Seraphine's Surround Sound are better than Pool of Reflection in every conceivable way. Therein lies the problem. Hwei does too much that in order to keep him balanced and fair, each ability has to function at, for the sake of argument, 75% the effective strength of another champion's ability to account for him having 3 different ones. That's why each ability feels comparatively weaker. It's not so much that I think Hwei is gonna have a 40% win rate in perpetuity, rather the concept of his gameplay makes it so he has to intentionally be kept underpowered lest he cannibalizes other champions. For all of Aphelios' weapons, he's still a marksman, bound to the governing constraints of a marksman, not to mention he can only ever access 2 at a time, so each weapon's allowed to be balanced at full power. In fact, he needs free attack damage, attack speed, and lethality to compensate. Hwei, on the other hand, has on-demand access to all of his abilities at all times, therefore it's simply not possible for them to be strong, begging the question, unless you're deliberately looking to play him because you like him, if you're an enchanter player, why would you pick Hwei over someone who's fully committed to being an enchanter? You could argue that he can dish out more damage than Sona or Soraka, but that comes at the expense of being worse at healing and shielding, the parts that you care about more. Vice versa, why pick Hwei for damage over a full-blown damaging mage? You can make a case for him providing token utility, but Zyra and most other mages can do twice or thrice the DPS of Hwei. I'm hoping by now you understand why being a jack of all trades is a bad thing in this game. By making someone who can do a lot of things, you have to keep each of those things underpowered, but by keeping those things underpowered, you lose almost any practical incentive to play him. So the only reason one would use Hwei is because they really like him, not because he's efficient. By the way, I am aware I haven't gone over his ultimate yet. That's because, funnily enough, it has no bearing on the rest of his kit, unlike Aphelios' Moonlight Vigil. Spiraling Despair throws a blob of depression that collides with the first enemy champion hit, sticking onto them and expanding from their location, during which all enemies take damage over time and are increasingly slowed the longer they stand within it. After 3 seconds or when the target dies, the blob explodes and deals heavy damage to enemies caught within. So this is a souped up version of Senna's Last Embrace, only instead of a root, it deals big damage. That's about it. It has no internal synergy with the rest of his kit. It's a standard ultimate. Bottom line, having more doesn't always mean better. As the saying goes, less is more. Personally, I think a better way they could have designed this paintbrush color mixing motif is by going down the Qiyana route, where each ability has a base function which he can then overlay with an additional effect. Here's an example. Instead of Devastating Fire, Severing Bolt, and Molten Fissure, instead he should only have Devastating Fire for his Q, and then depending on if he presses Q, W, or E, it throws out different types of Devastating Fire. QQ could be % health damage, QW could be damage that also shields allies, and QE could be damage followed by a conditional CC, like how Seraphine's Beat Drop works, so they get slowed, if they're slowed they get rooted, and so on. So he would behave similarly to how Qiyana's Grass Q gives her stealth, Water Q is a root, and Earth Q is damage. I know that might not sound as appealing as having 9 different basic abilities, but it does consolidate Hwei's use cases, thus allowing for better allocation of his power budget. Anyway, overall my first impression of Hwei is that he's a champion who looks like a ton of fun to try out, but the novelty can and likely will wear off quickly when you realize how superficial it all is. I'm not implying that he's boring or anything, it's that I can't help but feel like he has a ton of features but not that much depth. What makes League so engaging is that no champion's a silver bullet, and that's by design. Malphite's an armor tank, Galio's a magic tank, Hecarim focuses on hard engage rushdown, Lilia focuses on dancing around the edge of a fight. Zeri's about kiting, Samir's all about going guns blazing. Every champion has a defined identity. Hwei is characterized by the absence of one. He's a little bit of everything, but that also means he doesn't excel at anything. So to wrap up my analysis of him, I'm ambivalent. I'm glad that he's not an overpowered mess of a champion, but simultaneously he feels ironically one-dimensional. What do you guys think? Do you agree I'm prematurely doom posting him, or do you agree with my points? Feel free to share in the comments down below. For now, if you enjoyed the video, I encourage you to leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @VarsVerum, join my Discord server, and check out my other champion first impressions if you haven't yet. Until next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.